Thanks, Josh. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel DeTulio. I'm a senior accessibility engineer with Citizens Bank, and this is my session, Structuring Accessible Forms. So before we get started, let me just tell you a little bit about me. I've been working with the web for a long time. I got my first job as a web developer back in the year 2000. And I worked for a couple of software companies doing front-end web development before I decided to go back to grad school and study information studies with a endorsement of specialization in user experience design. And that's where I really got an interest in accessibility. I was able to use that for a lot of my coursework, and it's really informed my career ever since. So after I graduated, I continued to work for software companies doing front-end development, but I became the accessibility subject matter expert for my team. And I decided in 2019 to go ahead and get some certifications from IAAP. I got my Web Accessibility Specialist certification first, and then I got my CPAC certification after that. So with that, I felt like I could, finally make a career change to become an accessibility engineer, and I did that in 2021. And that's what I'm doing now. So as an accessibility engineer, I do accessibility testing of different websites, web applications, mobile applications. I write up recommendations for development teams, and I train and work with developers to have accessible coding practices, which is part of how this talk came to be. So let me go over the agenda before we get into it. I've grouped the talk into about 5 sections. So we'll start by talking about how to create form fields. Then we'll talk about requirements for grouping similar fields like checkboxes and radio buttons. Then we'll talk about marking required fields and optional fields. We'll talk a little bit about HTML ways that you can validate certain data formats like dates. And then we will talk about handling form errors when invalid information is entered. So I like to start out my talks talking about a definition of web accessibility, just to make sure that we're on the same page and you understand where I'm coming from when I'm talking about this topic. So the definition I have on the screen is web accessibility is the extent to which a website or web application can be used by disabled people. And when I say disabled people, I'm talking about the social or environmental model of disability, where we see the environment and society as causing disability. It's not something that's inherent to the person. We don't look at it with the medical lens that disability needs to be fixed. We need to adapt our environment and our websites to work for all users. And I like to display web accessibility as a spectrum. So I have here on the screen a spectrum that goes from less on the left-hand side to more on the right-hand side. And there's a little indicator towards the more end of the spectrum. And this is just to show that, accessibility is an ongoing journey. We're trying to make progress. We're not trying to be perfect the first time out of the gate. Accessibility is going to take training and learning and ongoing involvement from everybody in your team. It can't just fall to one person. So just think about making those incremental improvements. We can always get more accessible as we talk to our users and find out information about things that may not be working for them. So I really encourage you to test your designs and include disabled users as you're building and testing to make sure that they're working for folks. So how do we make things that are usable and accessible? Well, we start with semantic HTML, semantic markup. And semantic markup means using native HTML elements first. So there are a lot of things that come out of the box with HTML functionality, like buttons and form elements and landmarks and things like that, that really help users of assistive technology get around our websites and our forms, and gives them a better experience than trying to create everything from scratch. That's not to say that you can't create custom form elements, but that's a little bit outside of the scope of my talk. I'm going to focus on what we can do with HTML, and then a little bit of ARIA. We are going to look at a few ARIA attributes that we can sprinkle throughout the form to make things more accessible, but we're not doing it to create any custom behavior or actions or anything like that. We're going to be using those native form elements, but we're going to enhance them a little bit with some ARIA attributes. So this is an example form that I created for this talk, and I'm going to use it throughout the remaining slides to show examples of what I'm talking about. We're going to look at some code examples in HTML, some very simple code examples, but I think there's something here for designers and developers. Even though there is code, I'm going to have some screenshots and I'll talk about best practices for why I made certain decisions in this form. It's not meant to say this is the right way to do it or the only way to do it, but I'm going to talk about things about this form that are accessible and things that you want to look for when you're creating your own form. After I get through the slides and the information, I'm going to bring up a demo version of this form, and we're going to use it with a screen reader so that you guys can hear what an accessible form sounds like and the different things that we're trying to listen to, like with name, role, value for different form elements, and making sure that things like error messages and help text get conveyed to assistive technology users too. All right, so let's get started. First, we'll talk about creating form fields. So labels provide visible and accessible names to form inputs. At its most basic, fundamental level, of form is a grouping of labels and input elements. These labels and input elements, they need to be not just visually close to each other on the form, but they need to be programmatically linked. And we do this for assistive technology. We do this using two different attributes. We use the for attribute on our label, and we use the ID attribute on the input, and they have matching values, and that's how they get linked programmatically. Let's take a look at what that looks like in code. So this is the simplest form setup that we can have. We have a label for cat's name, the first field on our form, and then we have an input type of text with an ID of name, and that matches the for attribute for our label. Now, why is that important? So what this allows is two different things. One, if someone's using assistive technology like a screen reader and they put focus on our cat's name field, then the label, the name of that accessible name of the field will get announced when focus is put on the field. So they don't have to guess or read the label separately. It's announced automatically. The other thing it allows for is a bigger hit area for actually selecting the form field. So when our label and our input are programmatically linked, we can actually click on the label itself to get focus in the form field, which can be helpful for people with motor impairments and is especially helpful with smaller inputs like radio buttons and checkboxes. So this is our basic, the default type out of the box is type equals text. You don't even have to define that. That's just the default, though it is best practice to define your types. But there are other types, and I want to talk about that just so you know that you have options. So some other input types I've got highlighted here on the screen are type of email, type of radio, or type of checkbox. And this is an example of how those might look marked up in HTML. They have an ID and they have a name, and that allows the information to be then we can semantically or programmatically link our input with our labels using that ID. And the name attribute allows the information to be submitted through the form. There are lots of other input types. Some others include search. You may have seen this. If you use the search input type, it automatically in some browsers creates a control to clear the search field. It's a little X icon. Unfortunately, it's not always keyboard accessible, but that is one feature of using a search input. There's also a URL input, which will enforce the formatting of the content being entered in that field to be in URL format with HTTP / and so forth. And there's also the telephone or tel input type. And this will actually, if you're on a mobile device, it will display the telephone keyboard for you automatically for most mobile devices, not all. All right, I want to talk about another attribute that we need to consider when we're talking about accessible forms. And this attribute is used when you are requesting personal information from your customer or your user, only personal information. So we wouldn't use autocomplete attribute, for example, on our cat's name field, because cat's name is not our name. It's not asking for first name. First name, you might use autocomplete attribute. But on the field, we do ask for your email address. So since we're asking for personal information from the user, we're going to go ahead and use the autocomplete attribute. And there are predefined autocomplete values. They are available online. You can just search for autocomplete attribute. I've got a link in the slide notes here. And that will tell you the correct autocomplete attribute value to use when you're requesting personal information. So common ones are like first name, last name, things like address elements, street address, city, zip code. There's even ones for storing credit card information, which you may have seen if you've used certain websites that are using autocomplete values. So this is really important for not only complying with WCAG, but it really makes forms easier to fill out for some people who have cognitive impairments. So I've got a screenshot below the HTML here on the screen of the your email field. And in the text field, I've typed the letter D. And in doing so, a little menu has popped down, an autocomplete suggestion menu, and it has demo1@test.com as a suggested email address because that's an email that I've used before. So the browser remembers that, and it can offer that as an autocomplete value if forms are correctly implemented. And this really helps folks not to have to retype the same information over and over again, which can be really useful if you've got good data in your browser. So I want to talk about one more input type. It's a different element. It's the select element. And this is, you might hear this called a drop-down menu or a single select menu. Some assistive technology announces them as a combo box, but they're not a true combo box in the sense of when we're talking about ARIA. But this will allow you to have multiple options in a list and with an ability to select a single option. So for that, we use a select element. We still have an ID for that element, and that ID will again programmatically link to our label for our select. And each of the items in your select list are created using the option element. So here I've got one option highlighted for cat's markings, and being solid, a solid colored cat is one of the options that you can select. So a lot of times in a lot of frameworks, these get created as custom combo boxes, mostly because folks want to style them in some way, but there are a lot of options available for styling select menus, and I encourage you to look at that first and try to see if a select element will work better for you than a custom combo box. It's less of a headache to try to maintain. Okay, so what if we have groups of related form fields like checkboxes or radio buttons? Well, let's talk about grouping similar fields. So to group similar fields, we use a field set, and a field set groups related fields, like I said, often radio buttons and checkboxes. And we give a label to our field set using the legend element. And the legend provides a label for the grouped controls. Let's look at what this looks like in HTML. So here on the screen, I have a field set element, sorry. And inside the field set, the first element is a legend element. And for this example, it says cat's colors because in my form, I have an option where you can select multiple checkboxes for the cat's colors. That's denoted here with the 3 dots in the form. And why is this significant? Well, what happens is when a user of assistive technology gets focus on the first input, the first radio button or the first checkbox in a group, this field set legend will be announced to users of assistive technology so they understand what the checkboxes are for. Because if you just came across a group of checkboxes that were different colors, you wouldn't know necessarily what you're selecting the colors for unless you have a legend and a field set that gives a grouping to that semantically and provides a label to your set of checkboxes or radio buttons. You can also use field set and legend for a group of similar text fields, like say an address. You might put all of the form fields for an address within a field set, just to make it clear that it's like the shipping address versus the billing address, something like that. Yeah, so let's look at what this looks like for radio buttons. I want to talk a little bit about how we mark those up. So again, we have our label and input pairing. What's a little bit different with radio buttons and checkboxes is that we put the label after the input, whereas with our text inputs, we put the label before the input. This is just convention. I don't know how it started, probably just so that things are left aligned. But we mark that up a little bit differently in the HTML. You can see here, instead of our input following our label, our input is actually nested within our label. And this just gives us a little tighter semantic connection between our label and input. However, we still need to programmatically link our label and input using that for attribute on the label and the ID attribute on the input. So we can see for the first radio button, we have the option of yes. For the second radio button, we have the option of no. Now, the radio buttons, you can only select one. So they have the same name attribute. In this case, it's altered because I'm asking, is your cat altered? Yes or no, or not sure, which is not displayed on the screen. But since you can only have one radio button selection, they share the same name because only one value will be submitted for that name. With checkboxes, it's a little bit different. Each checkbox is going to have its own name because you can have multiple checkboxes selected, unlike a single selection for radio buttons. And you can see here, I've got the for attribute on the label highlighted, and that matches the ID attribute on our input. So again, we've programmatically linked our label and our checkbox, even though the input is located within the label. While sometimes this will work if you don't use the for and ID attribute, it's just best practice to always programmatically link with for and ID attributes. What this allows users to do, as I talked before, is it allows them to click on the label to actually select a checkbox or a radio button. It gives them a bigger hit area instead of trying to hit those little controls. So it's really important that no matter what kind of input you're using, you're programmatically linking that label and that input. All right, so next, let's talk about marking our required fields. So no matter how you do it, you really need to provide a visible indication of required fields. There's research out there that suggests it is easier for folks cognitively if every field is marked as required or optional. This research was done in the e-commerce sector with people buying things through a shopping cart. I know I appreciate knowing if a field is required or optional. It helps me get through a form a little bit better, but there are other ways of doing it. In my form example, I've used an asterisk since that is still a pretty common way of denoting a form field. However, I include instructions that tell the user what the asterisk stands for, because we can't assume that everybody knows an asterisk means a required field. So at the very beginning of the form, I say asterisk denotes a required field. Then each of the required fields have an asterisk. There's one optional field, which I marked as optional explicitly, just to make it completely obvious. It's sort of a deceptive pattern not to mark optional fields, depending on how the form is done, because it encourages people to enter information that you don't necessarily need to collect, you just want to collect from the form. So we want to make it easy for folks to not enter information if they don't absolutely have to. Now, that's the visible indication of a field being required, but we also have to programmatically mark fields as required for assistive technology. And we do this by using one of two attributes on our input. You can either use the required attribute, or you can use the ARIA-required attribute, and you set that to true. And this will programmatically mark a field as required. And I will get into why you might want to use one over the other in a bit. But let's look at this in the HTML. So here we have our label, cat's name, and I've got the asterisk to denote that it's a required field. And then I've marked up two inputs. We want to use either or. We don't want to use both. So we can either use the required attribute or the ARIA required equals true attribute, but not both. Using both is against the HTML spec, so we don't want to do that. Pick one and use it. And we're going to talk about more about required and form field validation in a minute here. Let's talk a little bit about validating data formats. So there's an HTML way to do this. You'll probably do this in JavaScript. I've done it in JavaScript and HTML on my form as an example. But you can use the pattern attribute on your input element and use a regular expression as the value to define the data format using HTML only. You want to include help text, though, that indicates what the valid data format is so that users don't have to guess. So for my example, cat's birthday field, I have the date format of mm/dd/YYYY. And that's announced to users of assistive technology so they understand what format to enter the date. So let's look at this one in the HTML. So again, we have an input element. This time we have a pattern attribute added to our input element, and it contains a kind of nasty looking regular expression. You don't have to understand that or anything. There are websites out there that will generate regular expressions for you if you think you have a need for this. This particular regular expression is enforcing our date format of mm/dd/YYYY. I have a screenshot on the slide here that shows I've entered the birthday format incorrectly. I've entered 26/05/2020 instead of 05/26/2020. And when I've done that, I try to submit the form. There's a little HTML browser validation going on that asks me to please match the requested format. So there is a little default browser validation you can do around data formats, but we're going to talk about why you don't want to necessarily rely on that. Next, let's talk about how we convey to our users, the ones who are using assistive technology, what this date format is. Let's see how we do that. We use another ARIA attribute called ARIA described by. And what ARIA described by allows you to do is add an additional description to your form field that gets announced at the end of the text. So here I have an error. I have our help text marked up. Birthday format is month mm/dd/YYY. And then we have our input, and our input has the ARIA described by attribute, and its value matches the ID of our help text. So this allows them to be programmatically linked. And when a user of assistive technology puts their focus into our form field here for cat's birthday, it will announce the name, role, and value of the field, and then it will announce this ARIA described by help text so that users understand what format they need to enter the date in. There's one other attribute I want to mention that can help you with filling out your users filling out information like dates on their mobile devices. There's an input mode attribute, and it's just one word, input mode, and there are different types of input modes, but a common one is numeric. And what this does, there's a screenshot on the screen of my iPhone, and it's got the cat's birthday field. I've started entering the date, and you can see that the numeric keypad is displaying as the virtual keyboard rather than the regular full keyboard. And what this does is it allows for less likely to enter bad data because you have fewer keys to choose from on the screen. And because there are fewer keys, the size of each key is much larger. So you have a bigger hit area to try to enter the correct data. So like I said, there are other input mode types. You can look those up, but a common one is to use either numeric, or if you have a telephone field, there's an input mode for telephone as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about our required fields and data validation. So there's a way you can disable HTML browser validation, and that's to add the node validate attribute to your form. If you want to disable any browser-based validation that's going to occur because you've used the required attribute. So the downside of using required is that the browser will try to do some custom error handling for you, and you don't necessarily have a lot of control over it. So we're going to look at some examples and why we might not want to rely on this kind of error messaging. So you can easily, if for some reason you have to use the required attribute, you can't use ARIA required equals true, you can still disable that default validation by adding the no validate attribute to your form element. All right, so let's talk about handling those form errors. So if your user submits the form with bad data, you want to return that form and you want to now include another ARIA attribute in your input. And that attribute is the ARIA invalid attribute, and you want to set it to true. And what this does is it allows assistive technology users to hear that a form field data is invalid when they return to that form field that's an error. The other thing that we want to do is make sure we're providing a visible error message, and we want to programmatically link that visible error message, just like we did with the help text, to our form input. So let's look at what this looks like in the HTML. So it's very similar to when we linked our help text for birthday format. Now this is for the email field. So we have email format is address@domain.com. Our error message has a unique ID of error2. And if we look down at our input, we have ARIA described by equals error2. So again, this help text will be announced after all of the information about the form field for assistive technology users. And since they tried to submit the form with bad data, we've also added the ARIA invalid equals true attribute so that it's further announced to assistive technology users that the information is in the wrong format or is invalid. So error messages themselves, let's talk a little bit about that. Error messages must be visible, they must be persistent, and they should be close to the field in error. I do two things on my form. One, at the beginning of the form, at the top of the form, I have a grouping of all of the error messages. And then within context of each field, right, I put my error message between the label and the form field, above the form field. And we make sure that that's visible to all users, that it doesn't go away after a little bit of time, it's persistent, and it's close enough to the field in error that you understand which form field the error is referring to. We also do not want to rely on color alone to convey errors, like using the color red. We can certainly do things like put a red border around form fields that are in error, but we also want to include like an icon with the alt text of error in context of our error message, so it's clear that the text that's being announced is an error message. And for sighted users, the icon reinforces that it's an error message and not some other kind of message. So let's look at a screenshot of a couple of the error messages. These are the custom error messages that I created for this form. So you can see we've got a thick red border around our inputs to denote that they are in error state. And then we've got our error messages, such as enter cat's name for the cat's name field. And we've got a little warning triangle icon to the left of our error messages. And if you're using assistive technology, that will get announced as an image error. And so it'll say error, enter cat's name. Error email format is address@domain.com. So with that, I would like to switch over to the sample form, and I'm going to start up the screen reader. I'm going to be using NVDA with the Chrome browser. And let's just listen to what some of these form fields sound like. What I'm going to do is let the screen reader announce the information, and then I'll repeat it because it can be a little bit hard to follow a screen reader or a synthesized voice. It talks pretty slowly, but again, I will repeat anything that it says. So I will now start NVDA.
Pane, register your cat.
Okay, register your cat. So I'm going to move focus using the tab key to the first form field, cat's name.
Main landmark, cat's name star edit required has autocomplete blank.
So it says cat's name, star, edit required, autocomplete. And we can see that the little autocomplete menu is dropping down. It gives us two possible options, Luna and Brienne. So let's hear what the your email field sounds like.
Your email star edit required has autocomplete blank.
So your email star edit required has autocomplete blank. And again, we have some autocomplete options that are listed below. The way that I can get to those autocomplete options is using the arrow key.
Autofill list expanded, Luna at test.com 1 of 2. Register your cat's birthday, optional, edit birthday format is mm/dd/yyyy. Blank.
Right. So that was a lot, but it said cat's birthday optional, edit has edit, and then it announces our help text. Birthday format is mm/dd/yyyy. Next, I'm going to move into a group of radio buttons. When I use the tab key, it's going to select the first radio button in the group. It's going to announce our legend, is your cat altered? And it's going to announce that there are 3 radio buttons and we are on 1 of 3 and it's checked. So let's hear how that sounds.
Is your cat altered? Star grouping, not sure radio button checked 1 of 3. Yes radio button checked 2 of 3. No radio button checked 3 of 3.
All right, next I'm going to tab to the cat's markings field, which is one of those single select options.
Cat's markings star combo box select an option collapsed required invalid entry.
So cat's markings star required, select an option invalid. So now if we want to select an option, I'm going to hit the enter key.
Expanded, list, select an option 1 of 8.
So it tells us that the list is now expanded. Select an option is our currently selected option and it's option 1 of 8. So it's really, that's another useful thing that you get using an out of the box single select element is you get that list information. So I'm going to select different items in the list using the down arrow key.
Solid 2 of 8. Multicolor 3 of 8. Calico 4 of 8. Tabby 5 of 8. Tortoise 6 of 8. Tortoise shell 7 of 8. Tuxedo 8 of 8.
Okay, and if I want to select an option, I just hit enter.
Cat's marking star combo box tuxedo collapsed required.
So then it tells us cat's marking star and the selected option is tuxedo. And lastly, I'm going to select the first checkbox in a group of checkboxes called cat's colors. And there's some help text there too that says select at least one color. So that will get announced with the selection of the first input element, just like other help text.
Cat's colors star grouping black checkbox not check select at least one color.
So you could hear it say select at least one color there at the end. And then I'm just going to go through the other checkboxes just so you can hear how those sound.
White checkbox not checked. Checked. Not checked. Brown checkbox not checked. Orange checkbox not checked. Gray checkbox not checked. Send button.
Okay, so right now I have JavaScript disabled in the browser because I want to show you that default HTML browser form field validation that can happen if you're using the required attribute on your fields. And we're going to talk about why we don't want to rely on these. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the send button.
Please fill out this field. Alert. Cat's name star edit required has autocomplete blank.
So it put focus into the cat's name field, but first it announced, please fill out this field. So it announced the error message first without context of the error message. What's more of a problem is the message disappeared. it's not persistent like we talked about. The other thing is there are several errors on this form, but the HTML form field validation only does one error at a time. So it can be kind of cumbersome for users who might not understand which of your fields were required. And it's a lot easier to see every error on the form all at once, which we'll see in a second when I turn on JavaScript, versus one at a time. I'm going to go ahead and select that again because I want.
Maximize makes the window full.
Whoops.
Register your cat
Let
document.
me turn off the screen reader. Sorry, just a second.
Exit and
I'm going to go ahead and hit send again and show you something else. So we can see that our autocomplete suggestions are showing up over our error message. I'll hit it again. So our error message, we don't have any control on where it displays, and we don't really have much control on what the error message is. There is a way to alter it to some extent, but it's just not reliable. It's not always reliably announced by assistive technology. Like if I left this field and went back to the field, since the error message disappeared, we don't hear it. So it's better to use custom form field validation and error handling rather than relying on this browser default testing. However, I'm using it as a fallback. So if JavaScript is disabled, there's this browser validation. It's better than nothing, but really you should be creating server-side validation and relying on that, and again, avoiding HTML validation. So let me enable JavaScript, and then we can go ahead and let me move my window just a second. Okay, so I've disabled JavaScript. Now I'm going to submit the form again, and I'm going to turn on the screen reader, submit the form again, and we're going to see what some better error handling is that's a little bit more accessible, looks like.
structure, register, main, your great send button.
Okay, so I'm on the send button. I'm going to hit send, and what's going to happen is, like I mentioned before, we're going to get a grouping of every error in the form at the top of the form, and most importantly, I'm moving focus from the send button to that list of errors so that users of assistive technology are aware of the errors after the page is submitted. So let's see what that sounds like.
Fix these errors to continue. Heading level 2 list bullet cat's name visited link is required. Bullet your email link is required. Bullet cats.
Okay, so we get the point. So we've got our list of error messages at the top of the field. We have a clear heading saying fix these errors to continue. Each of our error messages is a bulleted item in a list, and each of the form fields are linked in our error messages so that if somebody clicks, say, cat's name, for example, it will, or they use their keyboard.
Cat's name visited link.
You'll see that it's going to move my focus into the cat's name field when I hit enter.
Cat's name star edit required invalid entry has autocomplete error enter cat's name. Blank.
So that time we could hear that it was announcing the error message, error enter cat's name after the form field got focus. Let's listen to the one for email address.
Your email star edit required invalid entry has autocomplete error enter your email. Blank.
Yep, so again, our help text our error message gets announced in context of our field. So it's really important that users of assistive technology are aware of any error messages. Some folks like to do in-field validation every time a user interacts with a form field. I don't suggest that. I think it's a bit cumbersome and annoying. And what you have to do is if you're going to dynamically display error messages like that, you have to announce them to assistive technology each time that error message displays using a status role. And so you have to remember to make sure that your error messages are inserted into an element that already has role of status, and then that will announce the error message as soon as it's entered on the page. the only thing that's kind of frustrating, I think, about that experience is you hear this error message immediately when you leave the field. So it's like you have to go back and try to fix it right away rather than hearing it in context of like any error that's on the field by submitting it once. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but just something to keep in mind that if you are going to dynamically insert error messages, you have to announce them to assistive technology using role equal status. Okay, so that's pretty much it for interacting with the form. I'm going to go ahead and shut down the screen reader again. So just a moment.
Exit NVD.
And let me return to the presentation. I'm just going to summarize what we went over, and then we can go on to Q&A. So in summary, number one, you want to verify that each of your input elements in your form has a defined type, an ID attribute, a name attribute, and if needed, an autocomplete attribute. And then we want to programmatically link our input to our label using the for and ID elements. Number two, we want to group related fields such as radio buttons and checkboxes using field set and legend elements so that that legend is announced as a group name for our radio buttons and checkboxes. Number three, we want to provide data format requirements using the pattern attribute or using some kind of regular expression. We can do this in JavaScript too, but you can also do it as an HTML pattern attribute. Number four, we want to make sure that we visually mark all of our required fields, and then we also programmatically mark them using either the required attribute or the ARIA required attribute. And lastly, we want to add the ARIA invalid attribute to fields that are in error. We set that value to true, and then we make sure that we programmatically link any help text or error text to our form fields so that they are announced to assistive technology users. And with that, that's all I have. So I'm ready to take questions.
Wonderful. That was awesome content. So love hearing that. Love seeing the examples that you've shown. We have a ton of questions in the chat here, so I'm going to go ahead and just pop a few off here. Ryan asked, when is the right time to do validation and show error messages? Only on form submit, on blur, or during user input? Maybe after a short delay.
Yep, and I'm going to say it depends. Accessibility engineer's favorite answer. I encourage you to test whatever solution you come up with other people, with people who have disabilities or other personas that you have in your organization. There's no one right answer. I think it's pretty reliable to say only showing errors on form submit. I think everybody kind of understands that. The other methods get a little bit more complicated. Like I said, you have to automatically announce anything that's inserted on blur, for example. So just make sure that you're testing it and see if your users have trouble with this particular paradigm that you've come up with.
Yeah, I love that. It's never a one size fit all, right? So yeah. I think that whatever whatever gets the point across. I've seen examples where you have a block and all of the errors from the form are listed inside of the block, right? That could be a good use case as well. So here's another question around form errors. So Tony asks, would you leave space for the potential error message, or would you move elements on a page when the error has been inserted?
So I think that's more of a design question. I'm not a designer, so but I'm happy to try to give my perspective on it from an accessibility perspective. I don't leave space. I insert it in between the label and the form input, and there's an empty div there, but it's not taking up space until there's something injected into it. So I guess you could call that the form element shift. Again, test with users. You may think that just looks ugly, and maybe there's a valid design reason to not do that and to leave space, but I don't think there's any accessibility reason to leave space or not leave space. I don't really think it matters.
Yep, that's great. All right, I got one from Eric. Do you recommend field set and legend elements for a login form with email and password fields?
Probably not. It's a short form and it only has 2 inputs. I think the context is pretty straightforward. People understand if there's a username or email field and then a password field. That's a pretty common paradigm. I don't think you need field set and legend, but it wouldn't hurt necessarily, assuming the legend that you chose made sense.
Great answer. All right, we got another one from Lori. Wouldn't you hide the asterisk/star from the screen readers with ARIA hidden true, seeing as the required attribute already announces the field is required?
Yes, so it's funny, I actually had kind of a discussion about which way I wanted to present that in this talk. Originally, I was hiding it using ARIA hidden. I just decided that I didn't want to talk about ARIA hidden in this talk. It's such a powerful attribute, and you can really disable a lot of content on your page pretty quickly by inadvertently using ARIA hidden equals true in the wrong place. So if you know how to use it, I see no reason that you shouldn't hide the star. The only use case we could come up with is sometimes sighted users with cognitive impairments will be using screen readers, and they may not understand why the star isn't announced if they can visually see it on the page. But again, I encourage you to test and see if that's a problem for anyone.
Excellent. All right, so we have a few other questions, and I'm going to kind of generalize these. So they're about error and help text, right?
Okay.
Do you use the label element for help text and errors? What's the right point in time to display those or use those elements for those kind of texts?
Yeah, so label should not be used for error messages and inputs. Error messages and help text. I had those marked up using p tags. They're just supplemental pieces of text. They're not form labels specifically. I mean, that has a very semantic specific meaning. So I would not use those for anything other than the actual label itself. I guess you could be asking if you could insert the error message as part of the label. I suppose you could do that, but I don't see an accessibility need to do that. It works just fine using ARIA described by. It's a very well supported ARIA attribute, and it's really the preferred best practice way of handling those pieces of text.
All right. One other question here. Christian asks, which other screen readers beside NVDA do you regularly use to test ALI?
Yeah, so I use NVDA and JAWS. I use a Windows machine, so I don't have access to test with Safari and VoiceOver on a Mac, but you can certainly do that. I would encourage you to also test with Chrome if you can. On my phone, I have an iPhone, so I'm pretty proficient using VoiceOver for iOS, which is pretty easy to get the hang of. If you want to learn how to use a screen reader, I suggest looking up documentation for enabling that on iPhone. For Android, I can also use TalkBack. And again, if you want to learn to use a screen reader, that's another good one. You just enable it in your accessibility settings on your Android device. So those are the 4 that I primarily use. There are others, and there are certainly ones in devices from Xboxes to Fire Sticks. There are lots of other screen readers that you might need to use in contexts where you don't have a choice. But if I have a choice, I test with NVDA and JAWS, since those are the most used screen readers according to the data that we have.
Wonderful. Well, folks, we are out of time. I do want to say thank you so much to Rachel and our team. doing the interpretation. Sarah and Whitney, thank you so much. Really appreciate everybody joining us today. This has been great content, and we look forward to talking with you more.
Thank you.